Good evening, boys and girls, and welcome to our second to last night with Don Handrick. He's going to be talking tonight about what's so bad about complaining, and we'll have to find that out. If you haven't seen Don before, he's very articulate, with a really broad and deep knowledge of the Dharma, presents it very easy to digest. Don has been a practicing Buddhist for about 24 years. He spent 7 years studying in the FPMT's master's program. It actually is a 7 years program, not a 2-year program like we think of a master's program. He has been a resident teacher at Tubten Norval Ling in Santa Fe, New Mexico since 2006. He has also led the November course, which is a 1 month teaching retreat at Kopan Monastery just outside Kathmandu. So he's very knowledgeable. We've really been enjoying having him here. I should have my notes. A couple of things. If you're used to our usual protocol, when a teacher enters the room, of course, we stand out of respect for the teachings that he holds. If you're used to coming with Geshe-la here, Geshe-la always invites us to prostrate with him. Prostration, by the way, is a totally optional practice, and it's one that we do also out of respect for the teachings and as a practice in an antidote to our pride. Anyway, Geshe-la usually invites us to prostrate with him, but usual protocol is to wait until the teacher is seated and then prostrate. And again, if you'd rather just stand and wait for all of that to happen, that's okay. Let's see. I should let you know that we have Sakadawa, which is a big Buddhist holiday coming up on Friday. We have a very busy schedule. We're going to have precepts at 5:15 in the morning for those who want to take them, a medicine Buddha puja at noon, animal blessing and liberation at 3 o'clock, and then Geshe-la is offering refuge in the evening. If you're interested in taking refuge, you need to register today, so we're all ready for you. And Sakadawa is a holy day that in which we celebrate Buddha's birth, enlightenment, and passing into parinirvana. And I'm a little spacey tonight. Also want to tell you about something very exciting that we have happening on Thursday, July 6th. It's His Holiness's birthday. Every year we try to offer some opportunity to do a special compassionate practice in honor of his birthday as a gift to him. And this year we're sponsoring a blood drive here at the center. So we encourage people to sign up. This is one of the most amazing gifts that we can give to others, which is a gift from our own body to support the lives of others. And you can register for that with the American Red Cross, and there's a link to the registration spot on our calendar listing for that day. Last of all, when we offer teachings here at Kadampa Center, we never charge an entry fee, but we do have costs involved in keeping the lights on and bringing teachers in. So if you're moved by anything you hear tonight, we'd welcome any donations that you want to give from your heart. And Don should be with us in a minute. And I'm sorry, I feel like I'm really spaced out, but here we go. Thanks, Elise.
you need to? Oh, my tea is very hot. Okay, thank you. You don't want me to complain about that then? Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome. Let's just do a few prayers before we begin. Let's go to page 34. Actually 35, where there's the 7-limb prayer. So again, this is a bit more of a public talk than a Buddhist teaching, but we're going to be looking at the Buddhist teachings in terms of the subject of complaining. And so I think it's nice to, those of you who feel comfortable reciting these Buddhist prayers can do that with me. The 7-limb prayer is where we bring to mind all these various practices, 7 of them, that are all about helping us to accumulate a nice store of positive energy that we can use on our path, as well as to remove any of the obstacles that are in our way. So let's recite these 7 lines together. Reverently I prostrate with my body, speech, and mind. I present clouds of every type of offering, actual and imagined. I declare all my negative actions accumulated since beginningless time, and rejoice in the merit of all holy and ordinary beings. Please remain until the end of cyclic existence, and turn the wheel of Dharma for living beings. I dedicate my own merits and those of all others to the great enlightenment. And let's do this prayer that's at the bottom of page 35 there, the short mandala offering. So again, this prayer is one where we're trying to visualize the entire phenomenal world just transformed into a beautiful paradise, whatever that means for you, kind of completely purified. And we're making this vast pure offering to all the holy beings so that we can receive their blessings and inspiration, so that we and others can become just like them. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. That phrase in Sanskrit that we just recited means, to you, my Guru, I offer this precious mandala. Okay, let's go then to page 98. One more prayer before we begin. This is just reaffirming, as we talked last night, our sense of refuge or safe direction in the 3 jewels, as well as this motivation of bodhicitta, this idea that we're here with the biggest mind possible, trying to improve our own qualities and remove our negative tendencies so we can be of greater benefit to all beings. So let's recite this once in English, and then many of you know the Tibetan, so we'll do it twice in Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyan gipe sunam ki dola penchir sangye drupar shog. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyan gipe sunam gi drola penchir sangye drupar shog. Okay, you can set the prayer books aside. Let's just do a short reflection then before we begin. So Buddhism, again, is all about working with our minds. We're going to talk about this pattern of behaving that we call complaining tonight. But really, essentially, all this does come down to our minds. So we're just going to spend a few minutes in focused meditation, trying to calm the mind a bit, bring more awareness and attention to our minds. And then I'll lead you in a very short reflection just to set our intention in the right direction, to make sure that everything we do here tonight has the greatest possible benefit. So just get into a comfortable posture for meditation. Those of you who might be new to meditation, just the primary thing to pay attention to in regard to your posture is to make sure that the back is straight. So we don't overly straighten the back by like sitting more upright, but rather we just rest into a naturally upright posture where we don't need to use a lot of tension to hold the body in this position. The head should be upright as well, just on top of the spine. If you want, you can tilt the head forward very slightly, tucking the chin in just a bit, bringing your gaze downward. And it's good if you can keep your eyelids slightly open, but you can close the eyes as well for meditation. Then just in order to make sure that we don't have any other distractions in regard to our posture, it's good to bring your awareness to any places where there's tension in the body. Some of us hold a lot of tension in the neck and shoulder area. Just allow that to release. Let your shoulders droop down. We might also hold tension in the face, around the eyes, the mouth. And then anywhere else where you detect that there's some tightness in the body, just try to soften into those areas. So we're going to do just a few minutes of focused meditation on the breath as best as we can. If you have a technique you already use, you can do that. If not, I'll suggest that you tune into the sensation that occurs as you breathe in and out of the nostrils. That subtle sensation that occurs towards the tip of the nose is your focal point, and the instruction is simply to stay present there as you breathe in and as you breathe out. But no doubt you'll find the mind wandering at various points. Suddenly we'll start thinking about things we need to do tomorrow or later this week, or things that happened in the past, maybe earlier today or sometime in the more distant past. Or perhaps we even get distracted by sounds, other sensations. Whatever it is that pulls you away from the breath, when you see that that's happened, just simply let it go. It's like a cloud passing through the sky-like mind. We're just going to let it dissipate on its own and bring our awareness back to the breath. So I'll ring the chime. We'll do this in silence for just a few minutes, and then I'll lead you in a very short reflection to set our intention. Now let's set our intention for being here. It's useful to always go back to the bottom line of why the Buddha taught what he did, which is to help us to know how to actually achieve our quest for happiness. We're all driven in that way, wanting to attain peace, contentment. The Buddha's teachings are here to help us to know what is real happiness, what are the causes that will lead to that. And on the other hand, to also look at what it is that causes us suffering. We're all driven to not suffer. This is at the heart of all of what we do throughout our day. To be happy, to not suffer. So the Buddha's teachings are also to help us to alleviate our suffering, to remove the causes of our suffering. So I might invite you to begin this exploration of this topic tonight. You all came here with some desire to look at this topic of complaining, and to think about a time recently when you engaged in what you consider to be complaining. Think about the person that was there that you were complaining to, or the situation where you were complaining. May not have been a person there. Could have been on the internet, could have been in an email, could have been in a variety of ways. And just picture that, remember that. And first of all, ask yourself the question, did this lead me to greater happiness? Or did it cause me more suffering? And to honestly assess from your own observation whether that act of complaining was in any way beneficial or whether it was detrimental. And then to set the intention to explore this topic more, so that we can know for ourselves the causes that will lead us to have more contentment in our lives. To be able to abandon what leads us to more suffering. And to do this not just for ourselves, through exploring this topic of complaining in regard to our own lives, but also to help others, to benefit them, to bring them as well to a deeper state of contentment, satisfaction, well-being. So I'd actually like to open it up to see if anyone wanted to share anything that came to mind as you did that little reflection. If you're willing to share, you don't have to. It's sometimes useful to use it as a starting point, and then we'll move from there. But if no one has anything to say, I certainly have a few words to say. But anyone? Yes, Andre. There's a microphone headed your way.
So, since
Have to just put it really close. Yeah.
since the election last November, for me as an immigrant from a Latin American country, the perception of the U.S. has changed, and the perception of the political system, and etc. So for months, I was spending too much time reading the news, reading different commentaries and editorials, and feeding my brain with that, and complaining constantly about the situation, about these horrible things that are happening. And I realized I was getting sick, mentally sick. And I had to stop and just realize that situations, there are things that are beyond our control, and that was affecting me in my performance in my work. So since then, my my mental health has improved since I stopped like spending so much time reading news and
Right.
whatnot.
Right.
But it's still the fact that I'm not feeding my brain with that, and that I'm not complaining as I was doing before,
Right.
doesn't change what's happening out there.
Right.
So I want to have a little bit more of understanding of how to process that and
Okay.
how to process those facts outside of
Sure.
myself and my area of control without letting them affecting myself.
Mm-hmm. Good. Thanks for sharing that, Andre. I think one thing that you brought up is the fact that, again, the external situation doesn't necessarily change by virtue of our complaining, and it doesn't change necessarily even if we don't complain. This is maybe, again, a separate issue that we just have to recognize that life outside of ourselves is going to do what it's going to do. It's what we choose to do that will either lead to more peace of mind or more disturbance in our mind. So that's good to share that, to get that idea across. So thank you for sharing that. Anyone else, anything that they'd like to share from that reflection? Yes. I can't remember your name. Allie, that's right. Sorry, Allie. But yes, what would you like to share?
I think that is this working at all?
You have to just hold it really, really close to your mouth. It's kind of uncomfortable, I know, but
I think complaining is kind of a way of sharing your problems with everybody else, like sharing your problems with the people you're complaining to. So like, it's a problem of you're looking at something negatively, but then you're trying to get other people to look at it negatively as well, who maybe weren't before.
there is that side to it. Yeah. Yeah, I think that this is kind of a commiserating, what's the phrase, misery loves company. And so there is that element to some of our complaining, that we're actually, doing that to get other people to buy into it so we can all be in the same sort of miserable little boat together. This is something that frequently comes up when we're looking at complaining. Anyone else? Anything from their reflection on that they want to share? So it's interesting, this teaching that I'm doing, I'll give you a little bit of history of this, because I have done this before in a number of settings. I even did it over in England when I was there last year. What was interesting in England is that the word complain isn't quite the word that they use over there. And I was a bit surprised when I first sat down. It was a group in Liverpool, and I used the word complaining, and they all came to the teaching nonetheless and were kind of interested in this, but they were talking about it more like what you do when the dryer isn't fixed or it needs fixing. Like you call somebody to alert them to something that needs to be repaired, and what they would consider complaining is whinging. I never heard this word whinging before. But I think it's important just to talk about what it is that we're talking about here in terms of complaining. One of the inspirations for this talk that I started doing these way back in 2007 or 2008, something like that, was an article that Venerable Thupten Chodron, who I've mentioned a couple of times during my time here, she's a wonderful nun in our tradition. She did a little teaching called My Favorite Pastime, Complaining. And what she said is what constitutes complaining? One dictionary defines it as an expression of pain, dissatisfaction, or resentment. And then she says, I would add that it's a statement of dislike, blame, or judgment that we whine about repeatedly. Why say it once when we can indulge in our misery? So I think, just to say something negative about something, I'm not saying that that's necessarily complaining or not, but there might be some usefulness to that, to have something addressed. Complaining is a sort of pattern that we get into where we keep talking about things as if our talking about things is going to resolve something. And as was evident in what Andre shared, it doesn't necessarily resolve it. And as what Ali shared, it oftentimes sucks up other people into our little vortex of negativity, brings them into the same view that we're holding of seeing things in an unfavorable light. So those patterns are not so useful when we're getting into that type of a complaining pattern. Simply to say something that needs to be repaired or fixed or dealt with is one way that actually it's useful frequently to have those sorts of things brought to the attention of others. So this is more of a pattern that is in response to something that's going on. Another thing that was really the major inspiration for this was actually an art. I happened to be at the auto mechanic one day, and in the waiting area they had some New Yorker magazines, and I picked up one. And I don't really read that many of the articles. They're wonderful articles when I do read them, but I like the cartoons in the New Yorker. And so I saw one cartoon, and I managed to print it out from the internet, but it's a setting like this, but there's a monk up on a pedestal, kind of elevated area, and there's the people sitting on the cushions listening, and the one woman has her hand up and she says, "You say that life is suffering, but isn't it also complaining?" So, these are kind of the two things, is that it's suffering, and the Buddha said that it is suffering, and this is kind of one of the fundamental teachings that the Buddha gave, was that what we're involved in is fundamentally unsatisfactory. We use this word suffering, but it's really bigger than what we call suffering. It means that no matter what we do, no matter what we have happening, there's still a sort of an undercurrent of dissatisfaction because we're not in an okay state. We're basically dealing with a fundamental, and I like to split this word out, dis-ease. We're not at ease. We're always kind of looking for something to help us to have it the way that we want it, to be somewhat better off than where we're at currently. And when we have things that are against that, this is when complaining frequently arises, is we see all that stuff in our face and we don't want it to be that way. And we think that going into that pattern of complaining is a useful pattern. But I would say again, that cartoon that says, "Isn't it also complaining in addition to suffering?" Complaining is a form of suffering. It really is a part of our looking at our situation and falling into a bit of a spiral around thinking that that pattern is somehow alleviating our suffering, or perhaps helping us get a different view of our suffering, but all it's doing, in a sense, is compounding our suffering, making our suffering even worse at some level. So this is the pattern that we're looking at, is trying to overcome this through gaining some skill in the Buddha's teachings. And I'll be relying upon a little bit of what Venerable Thupten Chodron said in her article, because she shared some wonderful suggestions, but also a few that I've come up with myself. If we look at this topic of complaining, though, we can see that there's probably no end to what we complain about, right? I'm sure that each of you probably had some particular thing, and it can be politics and political situations. It can be policies of our government. It can be the wealth that certain people have that we might be complaining about, even those that we know or those that we don't know, the 1% or what have you. It can be our health. This is one that comes up frequently, right? To complain about all the things going wrong with our bodies, especially as these bodies age, and we have to deal with that reality. It can also be complaining about various people's personalities, their actions, the things that they've said, the things that they've done. So there's a laundry list of all the things that we can complain about. And probably each of us are in some sort of a pattern where we find certain things that we do like to complain about. Sometimes it's even just the weather, right? To complain about the humidity or the heat or the rain or the snow or the whatever. I mean, whatever goes on. So there's no shortage from that vantage point. And this is, once more, just demonstrative of what we look at in the world around us in terms of the truth of dukkha, suffering, that the Buddha taught. That really at the level of those things that immediately are unsatisfactory, that are painful, we can see that as an impetus frequently to complain, to go on, to grumble about all this stuff that is in our lives that causes us difficulty. But even those things that are pleasant, when they cease to give us the pleasure that we look to, in regard to those objects, or we find something unsatisfactory eventually about them because of the changes, what have you, that we have in ourselves, we see that there's always these patterns that we fall back into, of complaining, of thinking things aren't right and we need to say something about it. So again, this is a very common pattern, obviously. Venerable Thupten Chodron, in her teaching, she said, in essence, we complain about anything and everything that meets with our disapproval. So it's kind of interesting. Complaining is probably in the vein of, over the weekend we talked about this idea, and even I think it was Andre, not Andre here, but the other Andre who was here, who talked about the difference between what we might call an aversion and anger, and I was mentioning how we basically have a response to what, as Venerable Thupten Chodron said, meets with our disapproval, what is unsatisfactory, what we find as some sort of a negative experience. And complaining is a part of, I think, that initial sort of reaction to things. It's not at the level probably of anger, or it could escalate into that, but it's a pattern that is caused by that level of aversion, that level of finding that we're irritated and annoyed by something, and we feel the need to say something in that regard. I mean, the little blurb that I put together for advertising this class tonight, I also mentioned, how many avenues of complaining we have in our lives now. In the past there weren't so many verbally we could do it, and I'm sure many of us do it verbally in terms of talking to others, but there's so many ways that we can complain now, right? You can text your complaints to the people that you know. You can blog them. You can, put your little replies on various articles that you find on the internet. You can put them in social media. You can do so many different ways of venting and putting out your complaints. And so there's many avenues for us to really further that type of behavior. So I think we have to be somewhat mindful about how we go about trying to address it. So the first thing I want to explore in terms of going deeper into this issue is to really examine why we complain. A little bit was said by Ali, and this is one of the things that we frequently see, is that some of our complaining is simply to get others to feel the discontentment that we have. Be almost validated in that. I mean, there is a portion of that we want other people to say, yeah, I get why you're complaining. I get why you're saying those negative things. Kind of feels like we're getting their seal of approval, and we feel quite justified then in having those thoughts. Those thoughts, again, are maybe not so beneficial because they're the beginning of that process of aversion that could lead into much deeper states of anger, hatred, even behavior that follows from all of that. What might start off as a complaint can escalate pretty quickly. So I think that it's useful to take a look. Does anyone, before I read some of the things that are on my list, does anyone have some idea of why they complain? Why do you complain? It can be certainly what Ali said. I mean, sometimes we do want that idea. Was it Jeff? Yeah, Jeff, okay. Got a microphone coming your way.
I think ultimately I complain because I'm not getting what I want.
Right.
So that's that attachment, not getting what it wants. And finding the alternative to that unbearable. Like, I say this to everyone I know. I'm a Buddhist everywhere I could be except my car. Waving at these traffic lights, I go bananas. And it's because I'm not getting what I want. It's like I want to get going. I'm from New York. I like to keep moving, right?
Right.
So that's what it is, and it's not productive, but that's what it is. It's like I can't bear the alternative of not getting what I want.
Okay.
So it starts as a complaint.
Okay. And so in your experience in complaining, does it help to, in place of that unbearable feeling of dealing with what's going on, does it help to have the complaining?
No, because
instead?
sometimes I'll be complaining, I'll get honked because the light went already and I wasn't paying attention. No, it doesn't help.
It doesn't help. Okay, good. So it's good to recognize that again, these patterns of not getting what we want. Of course, one teacher said that really anger is just attachment not getting what it wants. And so we can see that our fundamental drive that we're always coming from is a place of wanting it to be our way. And when things aren't our way, that's again when complaining will come into play because we don't like it to not be our way. It's just our tendency, right? Our behavior that we have fallen into is always thinking it has to be our way, which is kind of an unrealistic expectation, right? I mean, one thing that frequently people complain about is the temperature. And even in like a room like this, you might have some people who say it's too cold in here, and some people say it's too hot in here. And it's like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, right? You need to find it just right. Well, just right for any one person may be wrong for another person, right? So this is the reality of the world we live in, is that it's going to be very hard for you to go through life always getting things the way you want, if not downright impossible. So when we complain, it's because we're coming from that place of having an expectation that it's supposed to be in our favor. The light's supposed to be green. The people aren't supposed to be, not paying attention. They're supposed to be right on it and going right ahead through the light so we can get through the light. We have all these expectations that we lay on the scenario that are totally unrealistic. So our expectations play a big role in this. I think that's primarily what you're referring to, Jeff, when you say, wanting things to happen your way, and what happens when they don't happen that way. So our expectations need to be examined. I think this is one of the most dangerous words that we have in our lives is expectations. Why do we leave our house every day, going back to kind of that driving or whatever you do? I don't know what the bus system is like here. Is it a good bus system? Does anyone take the bus? But even you get down to the bus stop and you just miss the bus. You think, well, the bus was supposed to be here at this time. Why were they early? Or that you're waiting there at the bus and the bus is late. Well, we have this expectation thing that we go from the moment we wake up pretty much till the moment we go to bed, thinking it's all supposed to fall in place for us. This is the way it's supposed to go. Well, who says that? I mean, is that like in the Constitution or something? All beings, all human beings are given the right to have everything go the way that they want every day of their lives. I mean, obviously not. This is not a realistic expectation. To have that expectation. Okay. Any other? Why do you complain? Yeah, Jill.
Validation.
Pardon?
Validation.
Validation. Yeah.
I only need to say that.
Yeah.
Can
I
you
think
speak
that's
to
a
that?
big part of it. We get validated in what we have to say in our views of things. Jill, he's got a microphone. Yeah. Yes. What's your name?
I'm David.
Hi, David.
The one thought that occurs to me here is that Buddhists spend so much time talking about nirvana, which my impression is that that's a place where, in theory, you get everything you want.
Uh-huh.
But now if you ask yourself realistically, could there ever be such a place where the whole universe is going to change itself every time your whim changes, and the whole place changes around and all the people in it and everything else? Now, how could that be realistically true? So how how can this concept fit with the reality that we know?
Right. That's a good question, David. Let's take a look at this, because again, this is maybe a peripheral topic to complaining, but it's good that it comes up in this context. When we talk about this idea of nirvana, we're really talking more about a mental state than we are talking about a place. And the idea is that if we are in a state of complete pacification of all these different delusions, different afflicted ways of looking at things, that this will actually be the solution to our problems, because no matter what's going on the outside, which doesn't change automatically by virtue of attaining nirvana, what changes at the deepest level is what's going on the inside. And so it's really more of a state of mind, and we could say nirvana is here in the same way that samsara is here, this pattern that we're caught up in. It's just a matter of whether we have a state of mind that is disturbed and under the control of the afflictions, or completely free and pacified of the afflictions. So my understanding of what we mean by nirvana, which I think is pretty consistent with what's taught in this tradition at least, is that it is a state where we have completely removed what causes us to have the disturbances. So all of this can just keep happening. The traffic light's not going the way you want and all of that. But you no longer have a mind that has any sort of basis for having that disturbance affect us, nor any of the patterns that follow from that, which includes complaining, which I don't think someone in nirvana, living in that state of mind, would complain, because there's no foundation for that. They've removed all of those tendencies. What does that idea sound like to you? Does that sound...
Well, suppose you start off in your car on a 1-hour trip, and you're motoring along, and then suddenly traffic comes to a screeching halt because of some accident up ahead, and you are stuck there on the highway for 2 hours until they get it cleared away. Now, do you have something to complain about, or don't you? You intended to be there, now you're late, you're going to be 2 hours late. Possibly you can keep your mind in a pretty good state and not get too upset
Right.
But realistically, though, don't you have something to complain about?
I guess again, if we go back to that idea that you might, if there is a situation, and this is actually something I was going to talk about at one point, if there's a situation where you can change something about it so that your complaint, you're saying something, registering that complaint or saying something about that situation can actually change by virtue of that, then I think that may be a valid way of complaining. Because I don't think we can say that complaining in and of itself in its entirety is to be cast away. It's this heightened sense of going over and over again in our minds, so that if you're sitting there and through the course of those 2 hours, you're getting more and more angry, more and more, and texting all the people that you know and calling people and complaining and doing all this, so that it becomes this huge thing that it didn't contribute to the solution of the problem. The problem is still there. You still spend the 2 hours sitting in your car, and your mind is now completely agitated. And maybe you've agitated the minds of several other people that you've texted and called in the process of this. So the more beneficial state of mind is to say, at that moment, oh, looks like I'm going to be late. Looks like I'm going to have this problem. If you know that you can't do something to clear it away, you can't suddenly make all the traffic start flowing, get the car that's caused the problem off the road or what have you, then you simply try to find more peaceful thoughts to entertain at that time rather than thoughts of complaining. Because we're the keepers of our minds. We're the protectors of our minds. And this is a key principle in Buddhism that this whole topic of complaining is about, is that if we want to follow those patterns, they're going to have consequences, and we are the ones that face those consequences more than others frequently, because we're going to wind our mind tighter and tighter and tighter by complaining more and more, and ruin our day in a sense. I mean, it's not pleasant to be in that state usually. Sometimes we feel like we need to get the validation, or we need to get someone else to share our oh, how horrible that's happening for you. Maybe you will get that from a few people. But how many people are you going to call and kind of talk about this situation? Is it really going to do any good for them? Is it really doing any good for you? If it's something we can't change, this is the wonderful, wonderful verse from Master Shantideva, this great Indian Buddhist master from the 8th century. In his 6th chapter of his text, Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, and I think it's verse 10, he says, if it is something that can be remedied, we'll use the word here, complain, that's not the word he used. Why complain? If it's something that cannot be remedied, why complain? His assessment of why we shouldn't worry, complain, do any of this type of stuff, is that first of all, if it's a situation that it can be remedied, it's something we can do something about, well, do something about it. Our energies are going to be much better served, and our interests in maintaining some peace of mind are going to be much greater if we do something about it. If it's something you can't do anything about, which the traffic situation sounds like one of those, right? If you could, make a U-turn and go back the opposite way and find another path to there, well then do that. Why not? Maybe many people are already doing that, and you can just follow them and have it go on your way. But if it's something you can't do anything about, well then does the complaining, the worry, the anxiety do any good? It's just going to wind your own mind tighter. It's just going to make you more irritable. So that, who knows what follows after that when the traffic jam finally clears and your mind is so tight from that having happened, you may be relieved that you're finally moving, but you may be more volatile than you were if you'd not let your mind get into that type of state. You might have an interaction with somebody that could be really quite dangerous. So I think,
possibly the painfulness of the experience will lead you to invent some idea which you would then communicate to the road commissioner about how things should be changed so that a year from now this doesn't happen.
Sure, I mean, and that would be a great use of your time while you're sitting there waiting, right? To actually sit and they go, I'm going to think of a way for traffic to be able to go around these sorts of things, and that's creative, and it's not coming from a place of that frustration and complaining kind of energy. It's coming from a place of, I want to solve this for myself, and maybe you can entertain the idea of even solving it for others so that everyone won't have to get stuck in these kinds of traffic jams. I remember Pema Chodron in one of her book, she talks about how when you're in a traffic jam, sometimes it's really useful just to start looking around at all the other people who are in the jam with you and really thinking about them and having some compassion for them, because you might think your situation is really important, that you need to get to where you're going, but you don't know all of their individual situations. Maybe many of them are not going to get paid if they don't get where they're going, or they're going to miss an opportunity to be, we don't know their stories. And we don't need to know their stories necessarily, because we can simply look at them through that lens of seeing the suffering that they're going through, of not having it go their way. And that opens up our heart a whole lot when we're no longer looking at in that very tight way around our situation of us being caught in the traffic jam. But I like your question. Did the question about nirvana, though, did that get answered satisfactorily in terms of the difference between it being sort of a place versus it really is a state of mind? Did that help at all, David?
I think what you're saying is that if we were sufficiently Buddhicized, then inside our minds, we would not become riled up by a situation.
Right.
We would remain calm, relatively happy. Maybe we're still thinking about our letter to the road commissioner, but we're not
Right.
freaking out about the unavoidable situation.
Right.
And so we've created a form of nirvana there,
Right.
as opposed to some kind of, I guess most of us have a Christian background, some heavenly situation where supposedly everything is wonderful.
Right.
Of course, it's all pretty unbelievable, really. I think. But you're not speaking of nirvana as being that.
Correct. That's very good. Because I think that, again, this idea that any time that we are choosing peace of mind over the turbulence of mind that these destructive thoughts are all about, we're choosing nirvana. We're choosing a kind of everything that leads in the direction of that culmination of that state. Now, of course, the Buddha taught that we can remove all of that completely, that the negative states won't even arise. So for in our situation, we'll still have the arisal of these things on the basis of other triggers, right? We might do really good with it when it's a traffic jam, when maybe we've got a bit more time, when we're not feeling that we're in that big a hurry and where we're going to, it's not that important. But then the next time we're in a traffic jam, when maybe we left the house a little too late and we're really worried about getting to our appointment, then it might trigger again. So a person who has attained nirvana no longer has any of that stuff to come from to make them annoyed in that situation one way or another. Yeah. Kind of interesting to think about as that being a possibility. Good, thanks for your question. And any other thoughts on why you complain? Yes. What's your name?
It's Elisa.
Elisa. Thank
I
you,
always
Elisa.
thought, I know this sounds weird, but children, when they're little, they
Mhm.
scream and cry for people to come help them when
Sure.
they need help. But as you
Sure.
get older, you're constantly told you need to articulate your problem.
Right.
So I have always seen complaining as people crying out for help. You know,
Sure.
they like the person, if they miss their bus, they might
Uh-huh.
not have a car. They might try to complain to somebody to
Right.
see if they could help out.
Yeah. And I think that is one reason. Thanks, Elisa, for sharing that, because I think that is another reason why people complain, is with the hope that someone will help them, someone will remedy the situation for them. And I at some level, again, because we're in an interdependent world, it might be useful for people to articulate where they do need help, because sometimes we're blind to that if we don't know that. If we're driving by a bus stop and we see somebody there that looks a little bit annoyed at the situation, we don't know that, again, they might really need us to give them a lift, give them a ride somewhere. But at the same time, I think that one of the problems with it being a cry for help is that there are times when perhaps we cry for help as opposed to fixing the problem ourselves. And then that may not be one example of the bus ride. But there are times when I think we complain because perhaps we don't even want to fix the problem ourselves. We'd really prefer other people to fix the problem. The planning, the traffic planning people or whatever, the highway commission, all of the various people that we might point to and say, it's their job to fix the problem. My job is to complain loud enough so that they do their job. Well, You know, I think there's a bit of that going around in society these days, you know, that we don't realize that we can actually be a part of a solution to a problem if we put our energies there, rather than complaining so loud that we hope that someone else will fix it, someone else will do what they need to do. Now, again, we're not trying to give permission for people to not do what they're supposed to do, but can we do something that's more productive as well, rather than simply going on about something, hoping that someone will answer our call like we're waiting for Superman to come out bounding out of the, you know, telephone booth and save the day. Sometimes it's us that have to save the day. Sometimes we are the ones that are responsible to do something about it. So thanks for sharing that, Elise. I think that's definitely a part of it. Frequently people needing that, needing something. And in that vein, as I said, it's not necessarily going to be wrong, because I'm not, again, taking sides on this in a major way. When complaining becomes problematic, becomes a bit of a spiral, I think it can be very bad for us. When complaining is simply to alert others to a situation that might require some assistance from them, it can be okay. But we have to watch those patterns and see how much we're really doing the first, which is simply asking for help or needing some assistance, versus the second, which is, you know, really getting lost in that. I think I did them in the opposite way there, but anyway, you got the gist of what I was saying, I think. So, yes, Shane, get a microphone to you, and then.
I'm not a complainer, but I'm often the recipient of a lot of complaints.
Yeah.
So what advice would you give to someone like me to say to someone who's frustrating me with their complaining?
Sure.
And I want to steer them in the right direction of being part of the solution, not part of the problem. How do you do that tactfully and quickly?
In 5 words or less. Well, no, I do have some suggestions for you. I just again think that every situation is probably going to be a little bit different. It might depend upon what that person's complaining about. Again, if it is something that is simply at that level of it needing to be remedied, they're bringing it to our attention because perhaps we're even in a position where that is part of our responsibility, and so we need to be receptive to that and hear that and actually do something with it. But there are many times we got a lot of people who that just keep complaining about how things are, and we know that we're not in a position to help change things. We're just their earpiece. We just keep hearing what they have to say. I think in those situations, there's a number of things. I'm going to share a few things that Venerable Thupten Chodron shared in her little teaching on this, because I think they're useful. We can discuss some of those. Usually I do that at the end, but I'm just going to be real freeform tonight, okay? Because these things coming up, I think they're all valid, all useful. So what she says in regard to some situations is she says, you know, she learned that if she earnestly smiles and is playful, that the other person loosens up frequently. So if you get somebody who's got that kind of high energy, complaining kind of attitude, and if we find sort of a more humorous and lighter way to approach things, that sometimes that diffuses some of that. The example that she used was actually kind of interesting. She says, one person I know is the chief of all complainers. She's melodramatic about her ailments, sucks others into her predicaments, and tries to turn all attention to her suffering. At first I avoided her, since I disliked hearing her complaints. When that didn't work, I told her that she had nothing to complain about. That definitely didn't work. You know, how often have we heard that? You have nothing to complain about. Well, does that stop you? No. I mean, okay. Finally, as I mentioned, she learned that if she earnestly smiled and was playful, that then this woman loosened up. She said, for example, in our classes, she would consistently be asking others to move because she was so uncomfortable. Since I sat directly in front of her, her complaints affected me. At first, my mind recoiled with, you have more space than anyone, you know. And she said, later I became more tolerant and would joke with her about the throne she had made to sit on. I pretended to lean back and rest on her desk, which edged into my back. She would tickle me, and they eventually became friends. I mean, sometimes somebody just needs to see that not everybody's going to buy into that kind of negative pattern, that somebody's actually going to try to shine a different light at it, a more humorous light, I don't, just one suggestion. Here are a few more. Another technique, and I think actually this is a really useful one, if we have the skill to do it in a way that isn't seen as offensive, is to change the subject. Some people will complain, but if we actually find something that they can sink their teeth into that isn't about complaining, but is something that is more wholesome, something that can actually begin to move them in a more positive direction, I think that's where we can be really skillful with our speech. But that takes some energy and some effort, right? Because not all of us have that at the top of our minds. Maybe what we need to do is think, oh, I've got that person that is always coming up and complaining, and actually spend some time thinking about what might be some useful things to say. Or discuss it with friends over dinner and say, oh, I've got this person in my life, he or she is always complaining. What sorts of things might I bring up that would be helpful to change the subject? There was one person that I knew who worked at a place where there wasn't a place to go out to lunch, so they all had to bring in their lunch brown bags, and they basically sit around a table, and that was their lunch hour. And so this person was feeling like they were trying to be more Buddhist in their speaking and reacting to things, and it was just all this constant complaining around the table. And I suggested to him that he actually do the work, do homework to find some things that could be introduced that could be interesting for people to explore together. And the example that I gave was based on something I saw on one of the morning shows at one time. It was about a man who made the decision. He didn't know anyone who had kidney failure or anything like that, but he made the decision on his own to donate a kidney. Just like one day decided, I've got 2 healthy kidneys. There's lots of folks out there that need kidneys. I'm going to give a kidney. But he made a condition for giving that kidney, and that was that the person who received that kidney, someone in their circle, would give a kidney anonymously. And then that would go forward. It's like a pay it forward thing. That would go to another circle for whoever received that kidney. Someone in that circle would donate a kidney. So you'd have like this ripple effect from this one donation of a kidney, kind of with that condition, that others would always be giving another organ for another donor or another recipient. And I mean, it's an interesting thing to think about and to talk about in a circle where you could actually get people looking at what some people might think, well, that's a really virtuous action. You might have other people who say, the guy's crazy. Why is he doing this? But you can get into a bit more of, it's not about complaining. It's about actually exploring some issues that may help people to see different points of view, may help people to actually explore topics around generosity, kindness. What does it mean? I don't know, it was just an idea. I'm sure he found other things to share with folks that would be of some benefit, but if we can change the subject, why let them rabbit on and keep giving, more and more complaints if we can actually help steer them into a more positive direction? The third one that she says is reflective listening, she says, is also an aid. Here we take someone suffering seriously and listen with a compassionate heart. We reflect back to the person the content of the feeling he or she expresses, by saying, well, it sounds like things are going really hard for you. Sometimes when they hear that, and I don't know if this is the case with, any experiences you've had, it sort of stops it because they've been heard then. It goes back to a bit of, what has already been said around validation and people complaining because they need someone to say, wow, you're in a really tough situation. And feel for that person in a genuine way, as genuine as you can, so that we acknowledge and recognize their suffering. And then frequently there's not a whole lot more to complain about because they've been heard. Again, just another suggestion. The last one that she says is, sometimes we get the feeling that others complain simply to hear themselves talk, that they don't really want to resolve their difficulties. We sense that they've told the story many times in the past to various people and are stuck in a rut of their own making. In this case, she says, I put the ball in their court by asking, what ideas do you have for what can be done? So it's like, if you're going to keep complaining, well, I'm going to challenge you to come up with some solution to that. If it's really something that you're that passionate about, once more steer them into that. If this is something you think you can do something about, well then, what would you do about it? What would you change? What is it that you'd like to see happen? Maybe you're not in a position where you can do something about that, but it causes them to shift gears and move into the resolution to the problem, rather than continuing to spin their wheels, complaining more and more. I don't know if any of those 4 are useful. Maybe there's other suggestions from people in the room. How have you dealt with people who complain a lot? If you're one of those people who complains a lot, how have other people dealt with you? Run. Anyone? Anything else to share? So I think it's challenging from that vantage point when we are around people who complain a lot. I can't remember your
Peter.
name. Peter, that's right.
Yes.
You were the other Peter in the room in addition to Peter back
Right.
then. Yes. Okay, good.
The last example,
Uh-huh.
you sometimes come across people, and maybe this is my projection,
Uh-huh.
who see themselves as a victim.
Sure.
And that's why they complain, and it's solidifying their identity as a victim.
Absolutely.
And sometimes, they have legitimate reasons. Maybe they have, a bad situation
Mhm.
or whatever. But, and that is a challenge for right speech,
Sure.
try and turn that
Uh.
victim mentality, I guess, that maybe I'm just projecting it, but that's
Right.
sort of what you see, and you want to,
Reverse that.
reverse that or
Yeah.
open it up somehow.
I think it is tricky when that is the case, and if, again, they are in a position where it's the second of those things that Shantideva said, it's a situation that can't be remedied, then it's really very hard. But I think we have to try to get people to a place of acceptance that if this is the situation and they can't do anything about it, well, once more showing that these sorts of patterns don't really add anything to it. In fact, they just make people more miserable in the complaining that is perpetuated in the face of something they can't do anything about. But if it's something that they can do something about, then again, those sorts of questions like that was in the 4th. What do you see as something that could be useful instead of this? What do you see as something useful that could be done? But people who are in that victim mentality, I don't want to pigeonhole people in some regard, but I think we have a need to empathize with them, certainly, and understand why they're feeling that they're in that category. Because there certainly are many things going on in our world that exemplify why they're justified in feeling that they're being victimized. But to help people feel somewhat empowered in the space of that nonetheless, that there's probably still things that they can do to change their situation. If not change their situation, change their minds in the face of that. To see that this is something that they can develop some greater strength of character. This is almost getting again into the whole idea that everything that we confront that is some form of suffering or difficulty that we would complain about actually can be amazing opportunities for us to learn from. Rather than feeling victimized by the situation, we can go into it with that vulnerability, but knowing that there's a strength and courage that can come out of confronting that situation and actually learning to work with it. So I don't know. It would depend upon the individual and where I would see kind of the best way to help them to break out of some of that, depending upon the situation.
Yeah.
I don't know if that helps somewhat, but
it's-
so let's talk a little bit more about antidotes and kind of how we work with complaining ourselves. We just talked a little bit about when we have others that complain. Before I go into that, though, I want to look over my list and see if I had a few other things that I wanted to share about. The one thing I want to point out, and this wasn't in what Venerable Thupten Chodron taught, I'm sure that it's not that I'm teaching something that she couldn't possibly teach. I'm sure it just was the teaching and she didn't, put this out there. But in this tradition, in Buddhism, we frequently talk about karma, right? Yeah. Well, one question, well, why do I complain? Well, what's the karmic answer to that? Because we've complained in the past, right? Because we have that pattern. When all of these mental states and behaviors that we engage in are karmically influenced. Why does somebody get angry very easily? Because they've been conditioned to be angry. They keep falling into that groove. I like to think about the mind as being like a surface where we develop different grooves that we then tend to fall into very easily. And if you have a very deep groove in your mind that's very wide as well, you're going to fall into it really, really quickly because you don't have much ledge room, to crawl on. So you just keep falling into that groove. So if we look at our lives and we see that we're complaining frequently, well, then maybe we need to start filling that groove. And how do you fill that groove? By stopping complaining, which I'll talk about in a moment. But to really recognize that this is sort of a creative act that we're engaged in. We create the pattern of complaining by virtue of doing it again and again and again. And one teaching that I want to share with you in regard to this that really speaks to the behavior of complaining and how we might choose to see it is a wonderful teaching that came out of the what's frequently called the Arrow Sutra. It's from the Pali Canon, I believe. I don't know that you find it in the Sanskrit canon of the Buddha's teachings. But the Arrow Sutra is where the Buddha is teaching that there are two arrows involved in our suffering. And the first arrow kind of comes into our lives. It's like the traffic jam, and it's the person saying something that we don't like, and it's the irritating coworker that's always complaining so that we feel like we're being pierced by this arrow. And there's not a whole lot we can do about that arrow at the moment, because these are the arrows that are out there that are, again, influenced by our past actions, influenced by our karma, but we, at some level, have no choice but to experience them. They come into our lives. It's just, that's been created, that's what's ripened, that's what's on our plate. And frequently it's physical stuff, but it can even be mental things, mental states that begin with some level of unhappiness, displeasure. The second arrow, though, is an arrow that we pick up ourselves and pierce ourselves with. And this is where complaining fits in, is that it is a part of the mental process that we layer on top of what we experience. If you start seeing it that way, you can see that it's really quite separate from what it is that you're experiencing. So the traffic jam that David was talking about is one thing. You're tormenting yourself, in a sense, by continuing to fall into a pattern of complaining and getting more and more heated. The longer and longer that the traffic doesn't move, is you're piercing yourself with the second arrow. It's like you've already got the first arrow to deal with. Why do you want to inflict more pain on yourself? I really like this sutra because it speaks to the creative process that, it's really destructive, but it's a creative thing that we're doing. We're overlaying the situation with a whole bunch of thought processes that cause us more anguish, that make it even more painful for us in the situation. Does everyone see the point of that? And it's a useful tool when we start going into how do we remedy our complaining. Because it's once more to see that what is happening on the outside with regard to whatever the situation is one thing. And that, again, comes into our lives and we have to confront it and deal with it. But how we respond, or even, sometimes the words react, but react has maybe a bit more negative connotation. How we respond to that is more within our domain if we take charge of it. So the idea that this is a pattern that we've been buying into, that why we're good at complaining is because we just keep complaining. We just keep going back to it. We strengthen it more and more and more. We dig a deeper groove, a wider groove. Well, we have to start choosing not to do that. We have to start making decisions that we're not going to increase the strength of that pattern. So to some degree, if we'd really talk about how do we address our complaining, the first step is to take responsibility. And that second arrow is your responsibility. That's not coming from anywhere else. The first arrow, yes. You do have other people involved in other situations. And that arrow comes into our life, and again, we may not have an ability to avert it, to kind of step to the side and let the arrow go somewhere else. These arrows come into our lives, these experiences, and we do have to confront them. And this is the nature of our lives. And that's the first thing to understand is, yes, Joanna. Oh, we need a microphone.
I really think the first step is recognizing that we're doing it.
Yes.
Because oftentimes I do a lot of mental complaining, and I'm not even aware of it.
Sure.
And I have some friends who, when they communicate, I don't think there's any awareness on their part that I can see that they see that as complaining.
Right.
So I think that's the first step.
Absolutely. I think that's a good way to put it, that we do have to, become aware that this is a process that that we're doing, that we repeat frequently, or that is a part of our makeup. So that attention, that awareness, again, each of us know that from the Buddhist path, a lot of it is about generating some sense of mindful awareness, some understanding and attentiveness to what's going on so that we become aware when we start going to that place of complaining. We've recognized it as something that we do, and we're aware that we're falling into that thought process. It's going to move us in that direction. We're picking up the second arrow, and we're getting ready to do that. But as you said, we have to recognize that this is a pattern. So taking responsibility for it. Yes. Oh, we got another question. Okay.
Is this on?
It is on. Remind me of your name. I think
I've not been here before.
Oh, you
My
haven't?
name is
Okay.
Bob, yes.
Hi, Bob. You look familiar, but anyway. Oh, he's
Right.
your brother.
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Brother Bob.
Hello.
Yeah. I
don't
guess
know if
that's what I'm getting. I'm getting that Venerable
I don't know
Kondo
if this- I don't know if this is-
impression.
I don't know if this is helpful to say, but I was going to say that second arrow is usually already in your hand.
Yeah.
You've been holding on to it.
Very good, Bob. Yeah. I mean, this is the thing is, and I guess to some degree, even what Joanna's saying is we're not even recognizing that we're picking it up, that we just do it so habitually that it's just there. We just keep going to that pattern. So we have to become aware that this is what we're doing. And we also, again, have different ways of framing it that will help us to take responsibility for changing how we're going to react to that first arrow. Because the first arrows, again, are always going to keep happening. And the person in nirvana, to David's question again earlier, is not going to have any platform from which to react to those first arrows, because those first arrows aren't relevant in the space of the state of nirvana. As long as we are in samsara, in this conditioned existence, we have to change the conditioning of our own minds. So one of the first steps that I want to talk about in terms of how we begin to stop the complaining, after becoming aware that we're doing it, after saying, I'm going to start changing my behavior, I'm going to stop picking up the second arrow. One thing that will stop you picking up the second arrow, I think, this is again sharing from the teachings that I've had exposure to over the course of the years I've studied, is to really see that the first arrow is simply a part of the truth that the Buddha taught. Going back to that cartoon I talked about at the beginning of teaching tonight, that, I hear the Buddha said that life is suffering, but isn't it also complaining? Well, the Buddha did say that it is suffering. It is in the nature of dukkha. It is in the nature of being unsatisfactory. So why do we have the expectation that it's going to be otherwise? If you have an understanding that these arrows, the first arrows that are coming into our lives, are going to be a part of being in this conditioned existence, well, then you're not surprised when they come into your life. You might still experience some pain or difficulty from them, but there's no need to complain because they are part and parcel of what it means to be a being in this world. I'm not saying it's okay. I mean, this is the whole Buddhist path, is to remove all of that suffering, to attain the state of nirvana where we are no longer, again, going to be afflicted by all of that. It's going to be kind of happening, but it won't be something that happens to us in a really concrete way. It'll be from a state of peace, a pacification of all of our deluded states of mind. So the Buddha's goal is to eventually remove all of that suffering, but as long as we're in this state, we're going to have these arrows coming at us. We're going to have difficulties and problems. Yeah, Ali. Let's get a microphone for Ali. Yeah.
Well, I think the arrows that you're talking about, finding something unpleasant or something bothering you, it's just it's actually just an indicator that you've got like some sort of problematic expectations or attachments,
Sure.
that you need to work through. So it's really something that's bringing awareness to a problem that you have in your own mind. So it's not like inherently unpleasant on the out, like the traffic. It's not an inherently unpleasant experience to just sit in your car, but because you had expectations that you're not going to sit in your car for 2 hours, then it's a problem. But if you become aware of it and you look at it and just realize that it's bringing your awareness to it, it's something else entirely.
Yeah. That's a very good point. And this is, another way that we can certainly frame this is to recognize that the label that we put on it of good or bad is entirely from our side. There's a story that comes from the Taoist tradition, Taoism, of a farmer. And I mean, some of you have heard this story before. It won't take too long to tell this story, but essentially the farmer has... The story is first the farmer has a horse, and one day the horse disappears, and the neighbor comes over and says, "Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that your horse ran away." And the farmer says, "Who knows what's good or bad?" And the next day the horse comes back with a wild horse that it's companioned with, and the neighbor comes over and says, "Oh, how wonderful, your horse is back and brought another horse. You now have 2 horses." And the neighbor says, the farmer says, "Who knows what's good or bad?" And the next day, the farmer's son is out trying to break the wild horse to tame it. And he falls off the horse and breaks his leg. And so the neighbor comes over and says, "Oh, how horrible, your son broke his leg." And the farmer says, "Who knows what's good or bad?" The next day, the military come through town and they're rounding up people to go fight in a war, and his son is left behind because he has a broken leg. So the neighbor comes over and says, "How wonderful, your son doesn't have to go off to war." And he says, "Who knows what's good or bad?" You get the gist of it. You don't need to go on for the whole evening. You know, we're the ones that make it good or bad, in a sense. We don't know what's good or bad. And you're right, our expectations, our thinking that having that be a particular way, like having the broken leg there, means that it's all bad. Well, there's another side to it that could actually be good. It's just an example, a way of looking at it and understand that having 2 hours of quiet time in your car on the freeway with the traffic jam might actually be really good for your mind if you use it in a way that's productive. You know? Oh, great, I get to meditate. I get to, listen to Dharma teachings, read my Dharma book that's here or whatever. I mean, I'm just, travel with a Dharma book all the time. You never know when it might be really useful. But framing it as good or bad, once more, is a part of that. And having the expectations that it has to be a particular way for it to be good, or else it is bad. Well, again, where's that coming from? It's only coming from our own minds. It's not inherent in that situation. How many times have you been in the line at a grocery store, and maybe it was you, or maybe it was somebody even behind you who was really, really annoyed that the line wasn't moving fast enough, right? And we can see that that person is making that line into a different situation than maybe the people that are behind them that are really quite patient and quite fine standing in line. So it's not the line that is the problem. The line is the first arrow. It's the expectation that you're not supposed to get that. You're supposed to go to the store and be the first one up there and get it checked out immediately, and then you can go on your way. So absolutely, complaining is our response to not getting things the way that we want. Kind of goes back to a lot of what we said. So this first thing of really understanding that this is the nature of what we call samsara, cyclic existence, that having things unpleasant arise in our lives is part of our experience, part of our existence. So get used to it, in a sense, And once more, if those things arise and you actually put some concrete positive thinking into it about how could this be avoided, or how could I do something to help other people who are in the same situation, or how could I use this time or this as an opportunity, well, that's much more wholesome than just complaining about it. Another thing is, this idea I was mentioning even earlier about you're in the traffic jam and you can look around and see all the other people that you might start having some compassion for. Well, bringing to mind compassion in regard to your situation is a really useful tool to stop complaining. If you think about the fact that you're never alone in what you're experiencing. It doesn't have to be a traffic jam where you're obviously with a whole bunch of other cars, or it wouldn't be a traffic jam. There's never a traffic jam with one car, right? So there's lots of beings there that you can think about, and there's probably countless beings in traffic jams all around the world at any one time. You can think about others who might be experiencing the same problem as you, the same difficulty, that same first arrow that you're experiencing. Your situation is not that unique. A lot of our complaining comes from the point of view that we're the ones that are suffering and we need to do something about it by just venting, by complaining, by saying whatever we need to say. Well, the reality is that we're never the only person having that problem. And there are countless other people with even greater problems than we have. 2 hours in a traffic jam is nothing compared to, living in a war-torn part of the world where there's bombs going off in every house around you. I mean, put it in perspective, a lot of what we're experiencing. Have compassion for others, and when the heart begins to open in that way, well, then there's no room for complaining, no room for that type of behavior. Another thing that we can meditate certainly on is, this whole idea of impermanence that I've talked about frequently over the weekend. Anything that you've complained about in the past, is it still in your life right now? I mean, maybe you have a few things recently, but are they still in your life right now? No, I mean, things have changed, right? You complained about this. You complained about this teacher when you were in school. You complained about, that kid when you were, in college, or where you complained about all these. They've all moved on. The whole situation has changed. That's the nature of our existence as well, is impermanence. I mentioned this phrase that we have in our culture that I think comes from a Judeo-Christian tradition of "this too shall pass." Well, it's a really wonderful piece of advice, right? Anytime we have something that's arising, that first arrow, well, this too shall pass. I'm not going to be pierced by this for eternity. It will change. The situation will change. So it's a great relief, actually, to kind of place our confidence in impermanence. Frequently, it's the opposite. We actually get kind of bent out of shape that things are impermanent because we want things to kind of stay fixed in a way that we find comfortable and, really in line with, again, what we expect or want. But the reality is frequently we get a lot of comfort from knowing that things actually change, that situation isn't going to remain the same forever. So these are some things that we can think about and contemplate. Another few things that I want to talk about too, though, as well, before we conclude, is this idea that we are frequently going back to that idea of recognizing that this is the complaining mind that is arising, this is that second arrow that is arising, is that we do such a good job at kind of identifying and holding on to that mind, as if this is how we need to be. Our world does not do much. Our world does not do much to kind of help us to move away from those types of behaviors. And in fact, what I was saying earlier, in that we live in a world where there are so many opportunities now and so many people engaged in complaining about everything left and right. And you can fight it again, left and right, in terms of attitudes in this country. People on one side complaining about the other, and people on the other side complaining about the one. And it just it's always going to be kind of fanned by all of this type of activity. Well, the extent to which we actually identify with that mind and think that this is something that we're going to adhere to, that this is worth paying attention to, worth putting our energy into, when actually the mind, the thoughts that want to complain, that want to do that, we can see, I like this term that I think it's Thupten Yeshe came up with, space junk. It's just sort of like stuff floating around in our minds that we don't need to take so seriously. Again, these thoughts arise. They too are impermanent. Things that we react to, things that we kind of are thinking we need to complain about, and we can simply let them go. We don't have to follow them. It takes a little more discipline to do that. But eventually this is where we want to be, is that when things arise in our minds that we find that are unwholesome and unhelpful, such as this complaining attitude, this complaining pattern, is that we simply say, I'm choosing not to take that exit. I'm choosing not to follow that train of thought. I'm choosing simply just to see it as something passing through the sky of my mind. And it's a harder process to do, but it's really useful because, once more, that's that second arrow that we are concretizing and piercing ourselves with. Well, we don't even need to make it concrete. We can just simply see it as just a feeling passing, just a thought, an impulse. We have to become much better at kind of analyzing our own minds. That's why I love Lama Yeshe's book, the title of it, Becoming Your Own Therapist. And we're often looking again to other people to give us advice to help us with our minds, when in the end, as I said earlier, you're the protector of your mind. You're the one that needs to decide what you need for peace of mind in this world. And so make that concrete decision that when those thoughts arise, you're going to simply observe them and go, oh, there's that mind that wants to complain again. Oh, how interesting. And there it goes. You don't need to grab onto it and say, I'm going to follow you now. I'm going to have some fun with you now. So this does mean we need some mindfulness and some process behind our making a deliberate change in how we're behaving, how we're acting, how we're thinking. Anyway, these are some thoughts. Let me see if there's comments or questions before we conclude tonight. You can complain if you feel like you didn't get what you wanted out of tonight.
I have noticed sometimes that
Yes, Carol.
what I'm initially complaining about, when I hear myself complaining about it, and really listen to what I'm complaining about, it's the recognition that, oh, that isn't really it.
Right.
There's something else deeper that is more hidden that I didn't really know was there.
Right.
So it's almost sometimes I think can be a positive benefit to complaining if you really listen to yourself, because often you can discover that there's something deeper and resonating underneath it. And then that is more the nugget of
Right. There's be some revelation there. Yeah. Oh, I agree. I think that this is again another part of the process that we can apply for complaining as well as a lot of other things that go on, is keep asking that question. But why am I thinking that? What is the underneath that? What is the thought process? We frequently call this deconstructing our emotions. That we can't just take for granted that it's all just at this one level. There's layers of stuff that are worth investigating. Of course, the Buddha says if we keep investigating, we find that the deepest layer, the deepest thing that is driving the whole show is a mistaken way of thinking about ourselves and thinking about the world around us in terms of how we exist, that fictitious way that we're buying into. But again, you can find lots of other layers before that that are useful, that are beneficial for us to see what's going on.
I think it can also be, if you recognize that within yourself, it can be a way of responding to other people's complaints, especially if they're repetitive, is to say, is there something else kind of behind this that, can help them?
Yeah. Yeah, if we're skillful, I think we can do that for others. We can help them in that process, to really get at what is going on. Why are they feeling that way? What is the deeper deeper reason why they're feeling that way? Not just some, again, more superficial response. Yeah, it's a good suggestion. Thank you, Carol. Anyone else? Yes, Jeff. So,
just real quick, back to the election, right? I like what you said. Sunday, when you complain, it closes your mind, right?
Sure.
And you only see you, right?
Right.
So, and I've said this, and I could be wrong, but and it doesn't matter who I support or didn't, but I observed on social media, and I work at a TV station, so I saw it. The people that supported Sanders were so pissed that Clinton did something, and they totally lost sight of, like, okay, well, look what you got now. It's had you just said, okay, and been gracious,
right?
Look what you got now. The grass isn't always greener, right?
Right.
And that, because it closes your mind and doesn't let you see the whole picture.
Right. Right. Again, complaining does have that potential to kind of put us in that.
Like they didn't step on me and say, okay, which one's worse or him. They were just sore that they lost.
Right. Right. Yeah, we can see ramifications of these types of behaviors. And we can even see them in a much smaller scale in our lives, because if we stay stuck in that mode of complaining, we're frequently not open to other possibilities. Yeah. Yeah, these are good observations. I could probably learn a lot from all of you talking about complaining. I don't know if you've learned much from me, but anyway. So let's just review real quickly what I've talked about. Again, that first of all, just to really recognize the things that we tend to complain about and maybe start paying attention, as Joanna says, become aware of the fact that we are complaining. Just to have sometimes that awareness might even be enough. I mentioned this over the weekend as well. Sometimes just having the awareness that you're doing it is enough to stop it. It might not take more than that. But for those of you who are more habitual in your complaining, it might take some of these other steps that we talked about, to really recognize that it's arising because of certain reasons and factors, and we can change our thinking at that time. Venerable Rabina says that we could call Buddha the first behavioral cognitive therapist. It's really about acknowledging that we, again, are the keepers of that whole process. We need to be aware of how our minds are thinking, the thoughts we're constructing, and deconstruct them, make them into something that is much more beneficial. And so that's our job in Buddhism, really 24/7, kind of keep on top of our minds and working with our minds. So lots of things we can introduce. Awareness of various Buddhist principles, such as impermanence and compassion, and the nature of existence. And certainly just, recognizing that we can make a different choice, that you can take responsibility for being a little bit more proactive in avoiding these sorts of patterns. Again, not to, as I said, we can't make a blanket statement that all complaining is bad. That's not what the evening was about at all. The evening was about recognizing that when it becomes problematic and when it tends to be based on a sense of expectation that is really unrealistic. But if there's something you can do about that, yeah, say what needs to be done, maybe get others to help address those situations, but recognize that once more, getting stuck in that pattern isn't going to be beneficial for you. And it's probably going to make a lot of other people annoyed in the process too. So, good. All right, well, again, I hope that there's been some use in some of what I've shared. And if there has, then by all means, try to apply this in your lives to make some changes in your mind and in your behavior so that you can help others and yourself to have greater peace and happiness. So let's just do, I really do like this prayer. Let's do page 246, this prayer from Master Shantideva. It is really quite universal in what we're saying here, in wanting to have everything that we've done here tonight, all the seeds that we planted, everything that we've created, to bring forth the greatest possible benefit for all beings, kind of having that wide open heart, thinking about the welfare of all. So let's recite this together. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. Again, thank you all for being here tonight. I really appreciate your attention and engagement in this topic, so thanks.
So don't complain about this, but we only have one more night with Don. He'll be here tomorrow evening, same time, speaking about using work as a spiritual path. So we hope to see you then.